Hello, so as we mentioned in the previous video, now that we added multiple of those contacts, once you close and run again, you will lose all of them because they are saved in memory, in the data source in memory. In order to retain or persist the contacts beyond one use of the app, we need to save it to a file on the device itself. So when the app is deleted or closed, the file is still there as a data file. So this is our next iteration, save the contact list to a file. So this is iteration 7, save contact list to a file. And the scope is clear, so problem formulation, although it has actually subsets. So in the scope, we'll need to have that the list of contacts is saved to a file, but that means that when the app loads, it opens the file and loads the data from there. When new contact is added, the list is updated and saved to the file. And in the first time, that the app opens, the sample contacts are added to the file. So this is all a breakdown of the details of saving to a file, because there are multiple touch points to the list of contacts, and each one of them need to also connect to saving to a file. So that in turn generates several testing scenarios. So testing scenario 1, open the app for the first time and add a new contact, then close the app and open it again and observe the new contact is present. And then maybe you can repeat multiple times. So in the solution formulation, we have the model, again, model view controller. So this time there's no change in the view because this is all happening behind the scene. In the model, there will be a change in the model because we created the contact person, and in order to save to a file, we're gonna save the list, and the list is in our contact data source is modeled with an NS mutable array. Go back to the early videos. So the NS mutable array is a library collection, and it can be saved to a file. But the contact person is our creation. We created it. So in order to be savable, that we can save it to a file as a member of a collection, we have to define how we want it to be coded, how we want each property to be coded. So we will need to modify the contact person class to enable its encoding, decoding for saving to a file. This is accomplished by incorporated the NSCoding protocol. In the contact list, in the contact data source, I think we call it ContactPerson contact data source, we will need to implement additional features to identify the location of the file, of the file and update the load contacts and add save contacts. We will use for this something for the first thing called FileManager. It's a library class, and we'll see how we can use that to get a location of the file inside the iOS file system. So in the controller, we're not doing any changes to the controller. All the changes are happening in the model side, both in the contact list data source as well as the contact person. So in the solution implementation, we first modify the contact person, and then modify the contact data source, and then test and commit. So let's go to contact person. So we need the contact person. In order for it to be savable, we need to implement the NSCoding protocol. The NSCoding protocol has two methods that you must implement, so they're required, so that you can encode, so you can define how to encode and decode. So it tells you here that you do not yet conform to that protocol. So the first one is about the decoding and encoding. So encoding is when you have the data and you want to define how you want to encode it. So I have three properties here, and the encoding is about the data and I have three properties. Each one of them is a string, so I'm encoding them as a string. So the first function to encode, and you can look that in the API documentation. If you open it and look for NSCoding, you can see a description and the functions that we want to implement. And both of them, as you can see here, are required. And the encode function, as well as the initialize. So we add another initializer to define how you want to decode it and initialize it with. So I'll start with the encode. So I'll say function encode, and here it is. It shows up immediately. And the encoder is that whoever will be interested in archiving that object. So we'll use that to define. So we'll say, so we're receiving a reference to an encoder, which is any class that is attempting to archive this object, which has to conform to the NSCoder. So I'll say use that parameter and use the encode function. And there are different encode functions, and it has a function for key. So it's working similar to the dictionary, that you encode the object of a particular type and you give it a key. And the key is important so that you know what it is and decode it with that key. So I want to encode the object for key. So I think this is the first one that I need, encode object for key. So the object I want to encode, for instance, is the first name property, and the key is gonna work similar to what we did with dictionary. Whatever you enter there has to be the same one you use when you attempt to decode it. So I'll encode not a boolean, last name, and this is last name, and then the last one will be my email address property, and we'll encode it with the code email address. So this function now defines how I want the three properties to be encoded or archived. Then the next one that I want to use is the init with decoder, which decodes the item back. So here is the init function, and it tells me here that I need to insert required. So just to follow Xcode's suggestion here. And I need to decode it. So this is going to be initialized, and then another one. It says that the property is not initialized first, so I need to initialize that. So this means that I will assign to the first name whatever I am getting from the decoder. So go to the decoder and say I want to decode object. So I'm decoding object for key, and then the key will be first name, and then I need to change the type of that to a string. So as string. And then I need to do the same for the last name. And before I so I'll say a decoder that decode the object, and this is the last name as string, and then the email address. So we decode this is email address. It has to be exactly the same as the one I defined before. And then we can, now that we initialize the properties, we run the init function for the NS object. So with the implementation of how we want the properties to be encoded and decoded, we have the contact person ready for the decoding operation. So then we go to the contact person data source, and in the contact person data source I had a load contact function, and this load contact function creates samples and add them, which is good for the load contact only if this is the first time that the app is being loaded, or in other words, if the file that has the contact does not yet exist. So how do we define that? So in the iOS directory structure on your phone or your device, there are folders, and within your iOS folder, within your app folder, there are other folders that you can access for writing data and reading data. So we need to retrieve a path to a folder or to a file that we can write and we can save. So it might be actually better to first save to a file so we can do the creation and then do the load contact. So since load contact is up here, I'm gonna put the save here as well. So I'll add a function called save contacts. And the first step I need to do is to get a reference to the file path to save contacts to. So since this is a distinct feature by itself, we can have that in a function. So I can create a function that says get file URL, and this function then will return to me a URL for the function for the file that to be saved. So in this case, saving contact will then first I'll say get file URL, and then I'll say call this function to give me that URL. Now that I have the URL, I can save the array, the contacts array, to the file. So to do that, I'm using a library called NSCoding, and this is a concrete subclass of coder that provides a way to encode objects into the different format that can be stored to a file. So I need to archive root object, and my root object is the contacts array, and the file that I have is, and it needs to be a string, so I get the file URL dot path, and that is a string that has the actual path to the file. Right? So that's all we need to do to saving. So saving requires learning about this class called NSCoding that has the function to archive root object. This abstraction of the algorithm behind encoding the array and saving it to a file is one of key benefits of a methodology called object-oriented programming, where you're able to develop a fully functioning app that saves to a file without really having to know the detailed algorithm for the actual saving to a file. Getting the file URL, in the past when we used NSBundle to get a file, we used to get a reference to the directory, which is the bundle, and from there get a reference to the file. This is very similar here, and I'm gonna break it down into a lot of details. So the iOS has a library called FileManager that give you access to different functions to help you manage the file. So we say first get a reference to the file manager, the default file manager. So I'll say let file manager equal file manager dot default. Then now that I have it, I need to get a reference to the folder. And there are multiple folders, and I have a document on Blackboard, or you can look on the Apple developer to learn about the different types of pre-existing folders, or if you want to create one. So I'm going to get access to the documents directory, get a reference to the home directory, documents directory, with read and write permission. So I'll say let home directory equal. So I'll use the file manager, not this one, the one I created, and then use the URL for, and then the URL, this one has it says the locates and create the specified common directory in a domain. So it has several parameters. The first one is the search path directory, and so to get that, I'll use the file manager, and I use predefined features in it. So this is the search path directory, and then there are multiple search path directories. So I want the document directory, so that gives me a reference to that, and I want to get it within the current user scope. So I'll say file manager again, and then I want to get the search path domain mask, which constant specifying base locations for the directory, and then get the user domain mask, which should give you the home user directory, and then appropriate for, we don't need anything for that. Create, like if it wasn't there, do you want to create it? Yes, I want to create it. So I got the home directory, and I'm having an issue here, and it says you haven't used it yet, but that's the warning. There's another issue, so it's probably gonna show up once we let me see. You call can throw, but it is not marked with a try. It has something similar to the audio file, that this function throws an exception or an error, so we have to add the try with the exclamation mark for it. Now that I got the directory, I need to get the file. So get a reference to a URL for the file that we will save. So I'll say let file URL equal. So I use the home directory and then append path component to it. And the path component will be the file name because I have a reference to the directory. So I just need to append the file name to it. So you can call the file anything you want. I'm gonna call it address book.data. This is anything that you want. And then the last step is to return the file URL. So return file URL. Those 4 steps, you can combine them together if you want. I just wanted to break them down for you so that you know what actually went through. I first need to get a reference to a file manager which give me access to my entire app folder on the iOS. Then I use that to get access to a particular folder or directory. Then I append a file to that directory, and then that gives me the URL that I give back to the user. So now that we did that, let's go back to loading the contact. So to load the contact, I first need to get that file URL. So get the file URL similar to what we did in save contact. So I'll say let file URL equal and use the function to give me the file URL. Then I need to check if it exists or not. Check if the file exists or not. So I say if and use the file manager, the default file manager. I have to get another reference to it. So I'm going to just do it within the if statement. And then check it has a function that gives me back a boolean that says if the file exists on this path. So my path is the file URL.path. So that's my path. And it will check if this is if it exists or not. And if it exists, then this means that file exists. So load the contents of the file, or it doesn't exist. So in this case, we create the sample contact. And when we create the sample contact, so we added that to contact, and then we need to save contacts as well so that it gets saved to the file. So how to load the contact? The opposite of the save, the opposite of the NS key archiver. So we'll use the NS. So we'll say we get the list, or we're gonna get the whole list in the contents of the file. So I'll say let contents, because if I use the NS key unarchiver and say I want to unarchive object, I can get either one object and then I need to get the type. So this will be unarchive object, and not with the data. I need to unarchive object with the file name. Unarchive object with file name. So the file name will be my file URL.path. And then that comes back as an any type. So I need to cast that type first to an NS array and put it in a variable, and then load an NS mutable array from that variable. So contacts equal initialize an NS mutable array, and one of the initializer initializes with an array. So So initialize with contents. So we unarchive the object and load it from the contents as an array of any objects. Actually, that's not the correct initializer. Oh, actually, we're adding it as an object. We're adding the content as objects from an array. So we're adding it as objects and contents as an array. So that loads the contacts, and if the file exists, if it doesn't exist, then we create the sample and save, which in turn archives and saves the file. So let's test that. So here are two. So we'll add another one. And save. And we need to add, when we add a new contact, we forgot, because it's not going to save. When we add a new contact, we need to save when we add, so when we add a new contact here, we need to save the contacts as well. Otherwise, it's not going to save. So we need to save when we add a new contact. So we add now we saved it. Let's go ahead and close that and open it again, and we should have that item still there and saved with us as well. So that completes this. So we can commit and push save contacts to a file. Thank you.